Billy Blue, my knight in shining brindle. Welcome to another episode of A Poet Reads to Write. Today I would like to look at the genre of fantasy. This is often a literature that is described as being escapist in its essential quality, and I don't think there's anything wrong with the literature of escapism. I rather like that term for this type of literature, but I think fantasy does much more than just provide a momentary, a fleeting glimpse of escapism, of escape from this reality or maybe stresses and tensions. Fantasy does, I think, a lot more than just that. In 2001, there was a wonderful English language analytic philosopher from the UK called Mary Midgley. And Mary Midgley wrote in this 2001 this beautiful book called Science and Poetry. As with many analytic philosophers, Midgley was particularly interested in epistemology, the science of knowing, of knowledge, of how can we really be certain of what we know, and also of aesthetics, looking at the philosophy or science behind beauty and the relationship between beauty and other forms of knowledge. And in this book, in particular, this is not a work that is anti-science or anti-materialist at all. Midgley was very interested in science and materialist ways of understanding the universe and our place in it. But Midgley, that gadfly of, I suppose, biological Thatcherism, Midgley was really interested in broadening things out. She wasn't interested in a reductionist way of thinking at all. In a matter of fact, she often parodied and sent up reductionism. She was very opposed, for example, to any idea of physicists coming up with a ace equation that could be reprinted on coffee mugs, for example. That would be the meaning, the answer to every question, as though physics could somehow, on its own, explain consciousness, our sense of being in the universe. Physics has its place, doesn't it? It's an important branch of knowledge. But can it explain everything on its own? Mary Midgley would say no. Mary Midgley, as I've just said, this is not an anti-materialist or anti-science book, but it is a plea to open things up, to accept, to acknowledge that science and materialism will only ever get us so far, and that we also need poetry, theology, other types of aesthetics, and of course for Mary Midgley, we also needed fantasy literature, mythology, all of these other ways of showing us how to be and find our place in this wonderful universe. So this is a wonderful book, and Mary Midgley is a philosopher that I really love. I'm probably more drawn to continental philosophy as a rule. I find a lot of English language analytic philosophy very dry and very difficult to get into. But Mary Midgley, like Bertrand Russell, are my exceptions that prove the rule. Midgley and Bertrand Russell I just love. So this is a fabulous book, and I think this is a fabulous way of getting into fantasy and looking at what is the role of, what is the place of fantasy within our other broader ways of knowledge. But in particular, the actual real purpose of this particular video is this magnificent Folio Society edition. It's the centenary edition, a real celebration of Lord Dunsany's The King of Elfland's Daughter. This is a wonderful book that was first published in 1924, and it's become a real touchstone for the genre of modern day fantasy. The Inklings, in particular C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien in particular, they really adored Lord Dunsany's work, and this book in particular was a real touchstone for them at the beginnings of this literature of the fantastic. Of course, they also went back to the 19th century and to writers like William Morris and George MacDonald. But Lord Dunsany was also very important. So, this is important. As you can see with this beautiful book, like with everything with the Folio Society, you have this beautiful cover. It's a beautiful cloth-bound majestic book, fully illustrated on both sides of the cover. It's just magnificent. You can see here the wonderful front piece of the white unicorns. This is a rather somber picture in actual fact, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit later. But here you have the beautiful white unicorn being chased by hounds, possibly even greyhounds like my delectable Billy Blue. And the idea of trophy hunting for unicorns is one aspect of this book that I really struggle with. It's the only aspect of this book I struggle with. This is a magnificent fantasy, beautifully written. It has a majestic sense, a majestic plea of moving beyond materialism. You know, Lord Dunsany also, like Mary Midgley, loved materialism, loved modern day 20th century science. He could see the benefits that were being brought to civilization. But this book is a wonderful plea, as with Mary Midgley's science and poetry. This book is a wonderful plea to accept that materialism and science can only ever take us so far to understanding the universe and our place in it. And fantasy, mythology, the realm of reaching out is always going to be a part of that vision as well. But unfortunately, this book does have this one sinister subplot of literally trophy hunting for unicorns. And, you know, the great Lord Dunsany, to the manor born. It's hard to believe, isn't it, that anyone, there couldn't be anyone besides a European aristocrat or a modern day trumper who could think it possibly that it was okay to trophy hunt for unicorns. So this subplot aside, the rest of this book is majestic. You can see this Folio Society edition. It just continues. You get this beautiful Abbey wove, beautiful thick paper. This book is personally signed by Erin Morkinson, who wrote the introduction. It's a beautiful introduction as well. And Julie Dillon, who did all the illustrations for this particular Folio Society edition. This was a book that was printed in limited to just 500 copies. And you can see here, I have copy 344. It took me a long while to convince myself, to talk myself into buying this book. I always wanted it. But I must admit, I didn't quite have enough money to buy a limited signed edition like this. You can see Julie Dillon's artwork here at the beginning of the book. It's just magnificent, isn't it? Beautiful use of colour. Quite a static image, quite a traditional image, I suppose. I think in some ways, this book, it would have been really interesting to see something really much more abstract and impressionist as a visual response to the text. But these are beautiful illustrations, lovely use of colour, as I said. As well as being introduced by Erin Morkinson, as you can see here, this book also contains a foreword by Neil Gaiman. So this book has not only been a massive touchstone to such fantasy writers as the Inklings, but also coming right forward to the 21st century and to such urban fantasy writers as Neil Gaiman. They also really look at this book as being really important, as being there right at the beginning. It's the fountainhead right at the beginning of fantasy as a genre. It is a magnificent book. Erin Morkinson, in her introduction, she really looks at her recent discovery of this book as it is for me. I can't believe I've only just discovered this book. As with Erin Morkinson, I always knew about it, and I'd heard Lewis and Tolkien talk about it and write about it often. So I knew it was there, but for some reason I never found place or time to actually read the book, and I actually never owned a copy of it until I bought this beautiful centenary edition by the Folio Society. So Erin Morkinson, in her introduction, really talks about how she also was a late comer to this beautiful story. And she writes a beautiful meditation on how the book has really transported her and really changed her own writing of fantasy. It's a beautiful introduction. Neil Gaiman, as with everything Neil Gaiman, he writes a real tease at the start, which also brings me back to that sinister subplot of trophy hunting for unicorns. Neil Gaiman, in his foreword, he writes this little barb at the beginning about how the English aristocracy have never been known for any great talent. You know, lots of crooks, lots of villains, lots of people very good at reveling in their own privilege, but never really produced particularly any great writers of any great note. And of course, for Neil Gaiman, Lord Dunsany was the one exception to that rule. Unfortunately, I would say that his background as an aristocrat, as a lord of Ireland, is also what, in some regards, partly brings this book, for me, a little bit undone. This idea that you could trophy hunt for a unicorn is really something that I find very worrying, very unsettling in this text. I can't believe that he was unable to interrogate that idea about hunting and the place of hunting in modern society. But anyway, he didn't, and it is a very important part of this book. Neil Gaiman ends his foreword with a beautiful meditation on magic, the role, the place of magic in our lives and why we need it. It's a beautiful little foreword reproduced in this centenary edition. Now for the actual start of the book. I'm not going to read a lot, but I thought I would have to read a little bit to you. You can see the beautiful paper of this particular edition, and the way, like as with everything with Folio, it just opens so beautifully in the hand. With a Folio Society book, you're never only reading the book to discover its contents. The reading experience, the having, this beautiful object in your hand is part of it. And you really do have a sense of the book as cultural artifact, as something that you're going to pass down the line after you're finished. So this is how Lord Dunsany opens this magnificent book. The King of Elfland's Daughter. Chapter 1. The Plan of the Parliament of Earl. You can see also this book is really set, I suppose, in that time of that sort of Anglo-Saxon, even Viking period, where England had many kings. Each county, in a sense, had its own king. So each place, there were many states, if you like, many counties of England, and there was no sense of it being a unified country as we see today. And I think this book is set back in that period. So let's get on with it. In their ruddy jackets of leather that reached to their knees, the men of Earl appeared before their lord, the stately, white-haired man in his long red room. He leaned in his cabin chair and heard their spokesman. And thus their spokesman said, "For 700 years the chiefs of your race have ruled us well, and their deeds are remembered by the minor minstrels living on yet in their little tinkling songs. And yet the generations stream away, and there is no new thing." "What would you do?" said the Lord. "We would be ruled by a magic lord," they all said. "So be it," said the Lord. "It is 500 years since my people have spoken thus in Parliament, and it shall always be, your Parliament saith. You have spoken, so be it." And he raised his hand and blessed them, and they went. They went back to their ancient crafts, to the fitting of iron, to the hooves of horses, to working upon leather, to tending flowers, to ministering to our rugged needs of earth. They followed the ancient ways and looked for a new thing. But the old Lord sent a word to his eldest son, bidding him to come before him. It's so beautifully written, this book. Well, the first thing that really amazed me at this book was how modern the language feels. The writing style just feels to me very contemporary, and the language is just beautiful. But in particular, his ability to evoke, to describe, to build this world. And this is a world that really has the world of Earl living side by side with the world of fairy, of magic, of the Elfland's king. And the only thing that separates these two existences, these types of existence, is a twilight zone. And you can literally walk on the edge of this county in England, and you can actually see the twilight in front of you. And if you have the bravery, some can maybe enter into that twilight, through to the other side, to the realm of Elfland, of Faerie. It's just a magical book. In this particular book, the main crossovers are animals like, for example, the fox. Apparently there's this wonderful mythology of the fox as being one creature from our side of the domain who can cross over into Elfland and come back to us with that tales of mystery and that sense of curiosity. That's where the fox gets much of its mythology from, apparently. And from the other side, animals or beings, like trolls and goblins, which in this book are more tricksters. They're not really evil or wicked, damaging. None of that Tolkien type of notion of a troll or a goblin. In this book, the trolls and goblins are very much trickster folk, and they can also come from Elfland, from the world of fairy, and enter our domain with messages, with communications, and to bear witness to other ways of being in this world, other types of existence. This is just a magnificent book. I'd fallen madly in love with it, despite, I suppose, in spite of the trophy hunting for unicorns. I can't pretend. A large part of the middle of this book is page after page of description of literally the trophy hunting for unicorn, for no other purpose than to have the creature's head and horn, that magical horn, on your wall as a trophy. It is a difficult bit to get through, the middle part of this book, when you're dealing with this trophy hunting for unicorns. I have no idea why Lord Dunsany thought that was all right, or to my way of thinking, of course, I just can't come at hunting like that at all. I don't understand it. This is another small section that goes back to this thing about science and poetry and the complementary ways of understanding knowledge of epistemology. This is what Lord Dunsany says in one moment in this book. This is just a short taste again of his beautiful writing style. And how the horns of Elfland blew over the barrier of twilight, to be heard by any ears in the fields, we know. I cannot understand, yet Tennyson speaks of them as heard faintly blowing, even in these fields of ours. And I believe that by accepting all that the poet says, while duly inspired by our errors, will be the fewest. So, though science may deny or confirm it, Tennyson's line shall guide me here. I just love that, this appeal, like Mary Midgley in Science and Poetry. This wonderful appeal that science and materialism have their place. They are going to unravel so much of what our universe is and how it works. But if we really want to get at the place of ourselves within this great universe being described by physics, by chemistry, by biology, if we're really going to get a sense of our place within this grand scheme, we are always going to have to return to mythology, to poetry, to even theology, as ways of being, as ways of knowing. And they have so much to share with us about what it is to be in this world. This is just a magnificent book. Another thing that comes with the Folio Society is this wonderful little pack inside the slipcase. You get this beautiful little fold-out package. It has this little quote on it from the beginning, a small poetic extract from the King of Elfland's daughter. Away with a riot of dancing and glory of colour, high in the light of the sun that had set from the sight of the fields, went wind and leaves together, and went with them Lyrazel. Another beautiful thing, I'm not going to spoil it in this review, but another beautiful thing that you will find if you discover this book for yourself is the names of people. In particular, there's a witch in this book, a good witch, who has such an important role to play in the story. And she has the most magnificent name. It really does take you back to Tolkien and to that whole notion of philology, the origins of words, and the mystery, the magic that comes with a word. In this pack, if you open it up, you then get from Julie Dillon this beautiful, magnificent artwork. And it is of the Lady Lirazel, the King of Elfland's daughter, being taken away across the twilight. And Lirazel is one of those, of course, who can, with her father's permission, cross the twilight between our world and the world of Faerie, of the elves. It's a beautiful image. I think I might even eventually frame this and get it put on my wall. I just love it. Julie Dillon, very conventional artist, but beautiful use of colour and lovely use of line and style. While we're talking about unicorns and whether it's okay to trophy hunt for unicorns, I couldn't go past giving you an introduction to this book. This is a very different way of looking at unicorns. You know, in Lord Dunsany's work, the unicorns, in a sense, are right. It is right to hunt them because the unicorn is a very proud and haughty mythical beast. And yes, it's magical and it's an animal, a wild animal of great wild beauty. But in Lord Dunsany's world, it is so proud and haughty that it is right that it is hunted by the goblins with the hounds and with the son of Lirazel. This is a very different way of looking at looking at unicorns, the beginning point of this is a collaboration between a very famous Australian painter called Arthur Boyd and an Australian poet, mid-20th century poet, called Peter Porter, a much loved poet in Australia by older folks like myself. Peter Porter lived most of his adult life in London, and he probably wrote, I suppose, quite influenced by other English poets, like, for example, Philip Larkin. Peter Porter had a very advanced sense of the work of a poem as a wrought work of art. And, you know, he really did have that sense of it being a great urn, you know, a great piece of art. He even often used metre, often used rhyme. So his ear was very much attuned to that real making of a poem, that shaping of a thing of beauty that lived on the page. And you'll get a sense of that when I read about a little bit from you now. But this collaboration between Peter Porter and Arthur Boyd on unicorns began with the discovery of the 15th century Romance tradition of German and French tradition, the great romance of medievalism, and in particular of a sequence of wonderful tapestries, wall tapestries that were made depicting the mythology, the story around the lady and the unicorn. And apparently there was this wonderful medieval romance tale of the unicorn being this wonderful wild creature that could be tamed by no one, could be hunted by no one, because it was so knowing and so quick at escaping any of the hunter's tools. The only thing that could ensnare the unicorn was, of course, being medievalism and romance literature, was, of course, the virgin. And the lady, the virgin, does tame this unicorn. They fall in love with one another. And this book tells of this longing, this romance, this love between the wild unicorn and the lady, and what happens with that at the end. And again, I maybe won't spoil that in case you want to read this for yourself. But in this book, you can see the beautiful artwork on the cover by Arthur Boyd. This is a beautiful book that's fully illustrated by Arthur Boyd, as I said, with accompanying poems by Peter Porter. And the starting place for this experience of unicorns are those wonderful 15th century tapestries that I was describing. Unfortunately, the tapestries are not reproduced in this book. This book is just the collaboration between Arthur Boyd and Peter Porter. But it's a magnificent thing. You can, of course, see reproductions of the actual tapestries if you look them up on YouTube, on the internet, sorry. So here's the first poem by Arthur Boyd. You can see the magnificent works there by Arthur Boyd. And I begin by looking at the Peter Porter poem. This is the first poem in this little sequence, a little verse cycle, if you like, telling the story or retelling the story of the lady and the unicorn. This one going right back to the beginnings of the whole thing and what happened with the unicorn and the ark. This is a poem Peter Porter wrote called The Unicorn and the ark. The tallyman stood with the pad in his hand, and all the way through the dripping land the official pairs stood, gland to gland. Oryxes, oxen, ostriches, orioles, salamanders, sandflies, civets and soles, Adam's named animals came from their holes. The gangplank was down, the ark afloat, streamers were flying, Noah in his coat. All the alphabet climbed in the boat. In heaven, mosaics were made of the scene, bright bits of glass to show to their queen, but nowhere at all was the unicorn seen. On high ground, where the sun was king, it hid from the rain and twisted its ring. I think this flood's a remarkable thing. A message came from Noah. Hurry up! The last quadruped's out of his stirrup. Your place is next to the narwhal's pup. The unicorn made shapes with his breath, hanging spittle on the rocks beneath. I don't believe in the concept of death. He came down the rainbow to the anchorage and rested his hooves on the water's edge to consider the ark's difficult portage. He touched the loneliness with his horn and dropped a tear on the freshwater lawn. I must be the pilot who weathers the storm. From this day forward, when men revive, I'll intervene in the angry hive to keep the worker bees alive. High on the sandstone of Ararat, a possum sucked a fresh loquat, while the unicorn knelt on his prayer mat. It's a wonderful use of humour, isn't it? Such a dramatic, evocative use of language. You can see this book, incredible, has this really glossy black paper with the type of the poems in white to highlight them. I hope you can see that. It just looks fantastic, this book. It does make it a quite expensive little hardback book, I suppose, but it's magnificent. I might just skip forward a little bit in the poem sequence. And now, here's a poem called The Unicorn Sees the Lady. The first time that these two great magical creatures, the Virgin and the unicorn, see one another. You can see that beautiful Arthur Boyd picture. Almost the unicorn is dreaming in a pool of leaves, the Virgin at the top. It's magnificent. The unicorn sees the lady. Following the speedwell and the buttercup, stalling in the blandest arbours, secure as the rag and robin itself, a naturalist with his fine pen, sketching a whole country's flora. In this happiness and overconfidence, I saw a lady walking, as if God had just said goodbye to her. I knew no way of describing my joy except to compare her to an anthology of Pierrot's crayons, the cataract fallen from Tobit's eyes, a fern shading of St. Ursula's sleep. She touched the ground and wore no strong shoes, but her gravity was levitation, her sweat in sunshine, mirrors for diamonds. She heard music, the Paphians played, the periodic table lent her numbers. She was gold or silver or beatitude. Something whispered, she is only a girl, deceiving her mother and her dressmaker. I had spies in heaven, I knew otherwise. Here walks the morning of the world, the pre-Olympian zest, the first Jew unstirred. What a magnificent poem. And continuing on, the beginning of the romance between the unicorn and the lady. This is just continuing on this poem cycle. This one is called The Unicorn's Love Dance. See me come dancing with my lance. I am the afternoon of beasts. My sunset is the edge of feasts. I am the morning of the dance. When Christ was laid in moss and linen, the dance was stalled, the beasts stopped, but at his tomb the unicorn cropped, so dancing moved to earth from heaven. I lay my horn in my lady's lap to bring mankind to innocence. We come from darkness and go back thence, and only love may hold a map. The next poem is The Lady's Acceptance. Oh, how could you say no to the unicorn's advance when it's written so beautifully? The Lady's Acceptance. Oh, gentle beast, I feel your tears. I pleasured my youth. I walked among the shadows of the world, my young desires attendant on my fears. Within the grass and clover flowers, the hot bee hovers on the stalk. Beside the lake, the waders walk, and nature withers with the hours. In this parade of works and days, let you and I withdraw our love, and watched by slow worm and by dove, in two cells assemble praise. Here's the beautiful painting, the reproduction of the union, the initial union between the unicorn and the lady. It's magnificent. I love Arthur Boyd's painting style. It's such delightfully comic, but also slyly comic, I guess. And he had a wonderful way of capturing movement and of painting mythology, those great stories that get us through. This is the last poem I'm going to read to you. You'll have to go buy the book if you want to see how the cycle ends and how the love between the unicorn and the lady finishes. This is the last poem I will read to you. It's called The Unicorn in Love. What else? Here's the magnificent picture again with the unicorn and the lady, with the sense of foreboding, I suppose, with the hunter's barb. I guess there is a real sense of foreboding in that artwork. Arthur Boyd's painting style is so evocative. He had a great way of bringing mythology to life. The unicorn in love. Bring me forest salad, the topmost leaves which wait upon the sun. Then I will eat my own will and be nothing but light for you to preen yourself by. Calm the stiff lakes, those bad-tempered inland seas. Then I will sail on them like a leaf and carry you to Avalon. Touch the heart of the tall pines and march against heaven, hallelujahing. Then I will bend them to your nursery to play soldiers with and dance. Encourage the pendant mistletoe, whose berries are really dying eyes. Then I will see with them and walk beside you through the land of the dead. Accustom the husbanding squirrel to apocalypse and empty granaries. Then I will show him how to stroke you with his tail and forget tomorrow. Curb the quail at his monogamous feasting, lest he out-chump chestnuts. Then I will waddle to your knees, crying, clock, clock, to the vegetable moon. Bring down the sun at 12 to make a fire for our polite kitchen. Then I will sparkle too and leap at the air and cry contentment of souls. Make a pillow of leaves which have cast themselves down in their prime. Then I will fluff them out with my breath and all night recite stories to you. Look in the pond which is reflecting my eyes at a tangent. Then I will meet you in water, which is the loving Father's tears. It's magnificent, richly dramatic and evocative poetry, isn't it? I don't think Peter Porter is read enough today. The only other Peter Porter book, or one of the other Peter Porter books I have, as I said, I do love Peter Porter. This is a beautiful selected poems that Allen and Unwin put out. a few years ago, just before Peter Porter's passing. He's a wonderful poet. As I said, in that sort of strong Philip Larkin tradition, I suppose, of the poem as a well-wrought urn. But unlike Philip Larkin, Peter Porter was not a misanthropist, and he didn't hate people at all. Like Arthur Boyd, he was a great celebrator of the human condition. He liked the light and the shade, and he was able to juxtapose and hold in tension those things really beautifully. It's a beautifully rich poetry, Peter Porter. Many of it is very evocative and rich with literary allusions. One of his most famous poems in this book, for example, is on looking into Chapman's Hesiod. So he wrote a lot of poems reproducing, I suppose, working with classical Greek mythology, a lot of the Arthurian type stuff. So he's a really rich and beautiful poet. Should be read a lot more today. I hope he's not going to be forgotten, because he really is quite majestic. So thank you for tuning in today. Most of this episode was really focused, the beginning point, the launching pad from this particular episode was this centenary, this magnificent centenary edition of The King of Elfland's Daughter. I'm not sure whether it's sold out yet. As I said, it was limited to only 500 copies. There might be a few copies left if you have a spare little sack of cash. This was quite expensive. It gave me a couple of sleepless nights after I bought it, I must admit, wondering how this was going to come out of my grocery money for probably a month, I'm not sure. But I am so glad I bought it now. I'm so glad that, like Erin Morkinson in her introduction, I'm so glad that I may have come to this book late, but I have come to it now, and I'm going to be rereading this book now for the rest of my life and passing this magnificent edition down to my adult children after I've gone. It's a magnificent book, and this is such a beautiful centenary edition, such a beautiful celebration of a great work of art that really is in praise of magic, of the world of faerie, and of, looking at what mythology can bring to us in terms of understanding our place in the universe. Can we really have a sense of well-being, a sense of wholeness without poetry, without mythology, without fantasy? And this, for me, is always going to be one of those great touchstones of fantasy literature. There is the difficult bit of hunting, of trophy hunting for unicorns, and I do warn you before you buy this book, that is something in the middle of the book that you're going to have to work your way through if you can. It is unsettling, and it does leave me very sad that Lord Dunsany wasn't able to interrogate that side to his hunting culture and look at something else. But anyway, he wasn't able to, and for him, hunting was part of existence, and that was part of being in the natural world, was to be the hunter of it. Of course, as a 21st century person, I have a different way of being with things, and it's a difficult thing, isn't it? The great Bertrand Russell was a vegetarian, and he wrote many wonderful works of ethical philosophy before Peter Singer, 100 years before Peter Singer, arguing for vegetarianism as the only ethical way of being in the world, and of coexisting with other animals and of respecting other animals other than humans. Lord Dunsany unfortunately never got around to reading Bertrand Russell, and I think that's a shame, because I think he would have had a lot to learn from Bertrand Russell, the other great Earl or Lord of this little small group of card players. So anyway, thanks for tuning in. I will see you again next week, and bye for now.